This podcast is brought to you by Humans, the next generation HRIS supporting distributed organizations globally.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So I guess, what am I famous for? I'm an internationally renowned HR, people and culture expert. I'm a super coach, so I do a lot of work with professional footballers, celebrities, CEOs, entrepreneurs, those types of people. Last year, actually, I was the youngest Chief Human Resources Officer on the FTSE 100, and I actually left my role to set up the Human Revolution. And really, the Human Revolution is all about providing a platform for people to share their lived experiences of work. My view is that corporate culture isn't really working for the majority of people anymore. If you look at any of the engagement scores, any of the latest thought leadership, and that's really what the Human Revolution is designed to achieve, to bring together a community of people who can, over time change how culture works in an organisation by providing a platform where they have a voice for the changes that they want to see.
Jordan, I'm massively excited to have you around today, so thanks very much for taking the time. We're going to spend our time together talking about building effective teams, which I'm personally very excited about the topic, so I want to learn as much as possible and extract as much as possible from you today. But before we dive into it, maybe you can tell us what is effectively an effective team for you.
So I think, the teams that I'm normally part of are the teams at the top of an organization. And I think, the teams that I've been a part of who've been the most effective and I've actually helped build, I think generally it's always good for a CEO to be very aware of what their strengths and weaknesses are. I think the best leaders that I've worked for, the best CEOs that I've worked for, have been very aware of what they're good at and what they're not so good at. And then actually we build a team based on covering some of their blind spots. I think diversity for me is really important. And I'm not just talking about, race, color, sexual orientation. I'm talking about diversity of thought, different perspectives, different ages, all of those types of things. And I think, an effective team are united in a common purpose. So it's very much around very clear on the strategy, how that all holds together, also what part of the strategy they're responsible for, but I think fun as well. I mean, certainly, we seem to forget that a lot now. I think work's become very serious for lots of people. And I remember, certainly the best teams I've been part of have been, a place where it's safe, where there's psychological safety, where you can be vulnerable, where you are more than just working together as colleagues, but you're also friends. And I think, it's a bit like family home life, isn't it? All of the things that we really cherish, boundaries, ground rules, we seem to forget kind of translating that into a work environment. But those are the things that are kind of fundamental to all relationships. So, I think always trust is so important in a senior team. That's what I would say about effective teams.
Why do you think the work is so serious this day? Obviously, we went through a market climate that was relatively challenging over the last few years. We've seen incredible explosion of growth after the pandemic. Again, things started to get a little bit more choppy. Now things are getting better. But what's your perspective there?
I think after lockdown, we were all kind of finding our way through lockdown. I think it's a shame that it took a pandemic to get us all to stop in our tracks and kind of rethink how the world of work actually worked for all of us. But obviously what it introduced was much more flexibility. People became three-dimensional again because, you saw people in their homes, you saw their family, you met their pets, you saw how their front room was decorated. And I think particularly for women, the whole kind of flexible working model that was as a result of lockdown has been really, really effective. So I'm a bit alarmed that lots of organisations are pushing people back in. But I think the downside of that, now that we've been doing it for such a long period of time, is that people are working so many hours because they're literally walking downstairs from the bedroom. They've got their own little office set up wherever that is in the house. And we're just on all the time. We're working really, really hard. I think also, if you think about what's going on in society at the moment, if you think about, cost of living crisis, climate crisis, the fact that there's 2 wars on in the world, this is really impacting people's behaviour. It's impacting how they feel as people. And I think obviously when all of this negative energy and all of this negative media is hitting everybody constantly, then I think ultimately it's changing it's making people feel afraid. And as a result of fear, people start to lose their trust in themselves, in each other. You know, we stop being kind to each other. People are thinking about themselves a lot more. There's a lot of pressure on families with finances and those types of things. So I think as a result of all of that, I think it's changing how people feel. And I think people are feeling insecure. I think so people are working harder. We don't know what's around the corner from a market perspective. You know, I think it's going to get worse. Does that mean that people are going to get laid off? So I think people are feeling very on the edge and insecure. And I'm not sure as a society that we've actually spent enough time thinking about what that means and processing it and actually acknowledging it. So, you know, I think from a business perspective, you know, a lot of organizations are really struggling at the moment. You know, profit at the expense of everything, but we know that that's going to be really short term. So I think when organizations are only focusing on profit because they have to, because of shareholder value, I think a lot of things fall by the wayside. We know that D&I budgets are being, you know, cut. So I think people are feeling very compressed and very fearful at the moment. And I think it's affecting how we all feel and making us work hard.
How are the best companies and best business leaders approaching this problem?
Well, I think you always get the best organizations. I think, unfortunately, they are very few and far between. All the best organizations we know about, they're famous, they have books written about them. But I think for the majority of people, they work in an organization that's somewhere in the middle. I think leaders who connect with their people, who are authentic, who know how to inspire and motivate employees during really difficult periods by bringing communities together, giving them a sense of safety, giving them a sense of purpose and that kind of shared direction. I mean, one of the things that I always apply in every organization I work in, I think it's quite interesting. I think typically for a lot of organizations, strategy sits around the top table. It's only something that's really understood by the most senior people in a business. But for me, organizations that do really well through difficult times like this is it's regardless of, you know, who you are in an organization, whether you run the reception, whether you clean the bathrooms, you know, you are able to articulate what the strategy is, but also more importantly, you understand what your contribution to it is. And I think the CEOs that manage to cascade strategy really clearly, I think they give people confidence about that their roles are safe, that they've got a clear thing to focus on and that their priorities are clear to them. I think that's how you do it. And also, you know, if you think about how culture evolves in an organization, it's all through rituals. It's through doing the same things at set times, set practices. And when things are like this in the external market and the economy, those practices are really important. So how do you keep an organization and a workforce of people connected during that time? I think that's really, really important. So you'll see the best leaders doing that, and you'll see the worst leaders only focusing on profit. Behavior goes down the toilet, so everybody starts to turn on each other. Egos get in the way. Politics starts to get, you know, amplified. And I think in those organizations, they're really going to feel the strain of that if their leadership aren't strong enough and human. I think it's that human connection between people.
Do you think there is someone that is or should be honing this piece? Like you mentioned, it starts obviously at the top with the CEO that is cascading down the strategy. But obviously CEOs can get busy. There's lots of priorities, lots of things. You can start with the strategy, but then you need people that can help you execute on the strategy, on the vision, improving the culture, the experience. So who's going to help those busy CEOs? So how their business leader can kind of, you know, contribute to make sure there is this kind of, you know, consistent approach?
Yeah, and I think, look, I'm a culture specialist, so I always start with looking objectively at how the senior teams show up. How do they behave? How do they role model the values of a business? If senior leaders don't do that, then you can guarantee that the culture of the organization is tick box. It's something that's talked about, but actually what the narrative is in the external market versus what the reality is of the organization internally is very different. And obviously then workforces know that that's not a genuine culture. So I think for me, during this period of time, it's really distilled down and simplified by how are leaders showing up? How are they behaving? So how are they behaving under pressure? How are they connecting with their people? If you only turn up as a leader to transact and issue orders, then you're going to have a very short shelf life in these current climates, I think. I think the organizations that are going to do really well are where they have leaders who are connected to their people, who are human, who ask them, how are you doing? How's everything going at home? You know, what's going on? If you don't know what's going on in your team and you're not connected to your people.
Connect the personal level.
Yeah, absolutely. So important. You know, if you think about all of the leaders that we absolutely love, they are great storytellers. They are connected, they're human, they're authentic, but they know their people. And not just by name, but they know their wives' and husbands' names. They know about their children. They know about their preferences. They know about what they're doing outside of work. And I think, I always do that with the people on my team. I get very close to them and I'm very connected because it's that through that connectivity and that sense of trust and that culture that you get the best results.
Ultimately, everything starts with the hiring process, right? So you want to make sure that you bring the right people into the company and then can help them, elevate them to make sure they can be really effective. How will you think about building the right team that then can evolve into teams that can operate in a way that is really, really effective at different stages, perhaps, of the organization?
I think the recruitment process is so important because, other than your customers, it's going to be the first point of contact that candidates and talent have with your brand. So I think that's really important. So that's why the candidate experience is super important for any organization, because ultimately, regardless of whether an individual gets the role or not, I think that you want them to make sure that they've had a really positive experience so that ultimately, whether they get a role or they don't, they talk about a fantastic candidate experience in the open market because they've met really impressive leaders. They've been asked difficult questions. It's been a difficult process where they feel that they've had to earn the privilege of working in that organization. And I think how that transcends, I think it's applicable through all levels of an organization when you're building a team. And I think, where you see things work really, really well is when the role descriptions and the roles that you create within teams are completely aligned to the strategy. I think similarly, a good leader should be really aware of each individual on their team, but also the strengths and the individual expertise that they bring. But moreover, how the combination of those skills actually works, for the greater good, and how that actually translates into delivery within a team and for the organization commercially. So I think the leaders that kind of are plugged into that, they build the best teams. And I think, again, going back to the diversity point, you don't want, and I think typically what you do see a lot of is, particularly in more traditional organizations, is leaders hiring in their own image. So ultimately you get groupthink because everybody looks and sounds the same. So we know that the organizations that are the most diverse, they consistently outperform their competitors because they are absolutely wedded to building.
They can be a little bit scary as well, right?
They can be scary. But my first experience of working life was working in Shell. So this was before any of us talked about diversity, and that was probably one of the most diverse organizations in the world. From day one, you were introduced and expected to understand every culture around the world. You would interact with people from all over the world because it was a global business. So diversity was never an issue. It was an absolute common thread that kind of weaved through everything that we did in that business. Do you know what I mean? Because it was international and it actually capitalized on everybody's difference. And we're talking about 20 odd years ago. There's not many companies that get things as well done as that. And the ones, as I said before, the ones that do get it right are the ones that we know about, that books are written about, that we do podcasts on. And I think we need to level the playing field more. I think a lot of organizations need to play catch up.
Absolutely. And when you think about the effectiveness there, like the way in which incredible teams can operate, are there specific initiatives that you observe, like, tactics that have been implemented to support those teams operating at the level they can?
Yeah, so look, I've worked in lots of different industries and sectors. So I've seen from startup to blue chip, and it's been a real privilege for me to kind of see how those different teams work. You know, I've worked in organizations where agile methodology has been approached, where, you know, you have scrums and you have different kind of, it's a very different way of working. I'm also involved with a movement called the Corporate Rebels. And really, I mean, that's really, really highly advanced. And the Corporate Rebel movement is very much around self-managed teams. So it's the absolute opposite end of the spectrum of most organization, which is still very command and control. And if you think about, you know, command and control and authoritarian leadership, that goes back to Victorian times. I mean, that's literally factory worker. And that's how still a lot of organizations are running their workforces, which is so archaic and also really disempowering for the majority of people in an organization. If you look at the other end of the spectrum where the corporate rebels are operating, which is really just around celebrating the organizations that make work more fun, they are all about empowering people to the point that they are so empowered, so clear on what they do, right behaviors, right alignment, that they self-manage. And actually the need for management structures is kind of obsolete. So I've seen both, but I think fundamentally for me, any high-performing team, all based on trust. If you've got a group of people at any level that don't trust each other, the performance will be terrible. And that's absolute non-negotiable for me. If you haven't got trust in a team, don't expect great results.
And when you think about efficiency, for me, a key component is the quality of the work that you can deliver and the pace at which you can execute.
Absolutely.
But the reality is, it depends by the type of organization you're part of. Delivering consistency, quality at incredible pace can be really stressful, right? So how do you think about that? Like, how do you ensure that, in particular, again, we've seen a climate where there was more expected from people, companies were facing lots of adversities. Like, how do you ensure the team can operate at incredible level without burning out, without starting to be inconsistent, without having, like, you know, a sense of, like, you know, losing even motivation because it's just hard to stay motivated?
Yeah. So what do we know? When leaders motivate and inspire their people, you get 110% out of them. It's really, really easy. So employee engagement, the engagement of the people on your team, which will come from your connection with them. It will come from how clear they are on their purpose, on their deliverables, how their contribution actually rolls up to the broader kind of direction of the organization. And I think, you know, it's so, if you come to work and apparently, I was reading something the other day, we're going to spend 60% of our lives, well, between 20 and 60% of our lives at work. I mean, that's a scary statistic, isn't it? So I think, you know, if we work on that basis, you've got to enjoy going to work. And I think it's all very well and good when organizations are performing really, really well. Everybody's riding on the crest of a wave. Everybody's engaged. People are making money if that's your thing, and you're in a corporate kind of, you know, into a you know, working in a money orientated kind of environment. But I think, you know, what makes us happy coming to work? It's, do you like the people that you're working with? Do you have fun at work? Do you like the leader that you're working for? I mean, 75% of people leave organizations because of bad leadership, not because they're not paid enough. And you'll see that in the best environments, actually pay is the last thing that people are motivated by. They are motivated by the quality of their colleagues. They're motivated by the clarity of their contribution. And I think where you know, going back to your point on how do you drive consistent results delivery at fast pace, I think first and foremost you make sure, which is often the case unfortunately in most organizations, you might have 3 or 4 key people on a team who are the highest performers, but more often than not, they're the ones that take the lead on most of the work. They're the ones that take on extra, and actually the people that aren't performing get away with doing less work and they're less stressed. So I think good leaders spot that, and ultimately, you know, let's be really clear. If you're a high flyer and you're highly motivated, if you're working with really talented people, that's how you drive performance. You want to know that you are working with people who inspire you as well. I think if you are the
people want to work with other great people.
Yeah, of course. So great people, you know, we all attract the same, don't we? So high performing organizations, people like, you know, GSK, those types of things, they have superbly talented people at every level and they don't compromise on it. But everybody works at that pace pretty much. It's a consistent expectation, not just pockets of it.
You mentioned a few times the role of being connected, caring about the people, learning about things they are, kind of, a personal level. But I think there is an impact of different business models related to that. For example, specifically, this debate now, how should we go back to the office, stay remote, hybrid? What's the best setup? Remote, there is this idea that can be a little bit too transactional. So it's hard to build up relationships when actually you're interacting mostly with the people that you're working on a daily basis. So there's less spontaneous conversation and a specific type problem versus the office culture. On one end can be helpful to create those spontaneous conversation, but people have different priorities in life. So I need a level of flexibility. I need working from home. I need to pick up and keep whatever it may be. So how do you put that into kind of perspective? Is there a specific setup that can be more kind of suited to kind of create the level of
I think it's really important that organizations don't apply a one-shoe-fits-all approach to this. I think good leaders know what the preferences of their people are, but they also know how to balance that with how to get done what the business needs to get done in order to be successful. And sometimes they're not the same thing. But I think in organizations where culture is really transparent and there's high trust, then more often than not, employees will trust that when a leader suggests, actually, I want to make this change, or I think that the way that we stay connected is by having X number of days in the office, I think people are more inclined to follow those types of expectations and requests if they're working for someone that they trust, if they know that they're not just a number. And I think if you think about I think it's a balance. I think balance is really important. I think, we're seeing a lot of organizations, particularly the old traditional businesses that we all know, forcing people back into the office 4 days a week. Well, that's just not going to work. And everybody's going to be pissed off about that. The engagement will go through the floor. We already know that 60% of the global workforce is apparently quietly quitting, which basically means that they're going to work, but they're not motivated, they're not engaged, they're not working for leaders that they respect. Well, that's estimated to cost the global economy $8.8 trillion a year. Now, that's enough to take down a whole country, the cost of that. So regardless of whether we're acknowledging it or not, the reality of leaders not inspiring their people enough is real. And you can see that in all of the research and all of the thought leadership, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of traction around it. So I think it's getting the balance right. I think there is a requirement for people to want to be at home more, and I think they should be. And I think similarly, for an organization to retain its culture and for people to remain connected, the balance of being in the office a couple of days a week as well. But there's loads of things you can do. You can have rituals, you can have daily stand-ups, you can have calls, whatever your team want to stay connected. It doesn't require you to be physically in the office 5 days a week. And we are seeing a lot of that. That's not something that I sign up to.
On the cultural side, like you mentioned a lot, the culture has this kind of critical role as part of how a team can operate, the standard they can operate, the level of efficiency there. Are there specific components of the company culture that, in your opinion, have a highest level of impact in the way in which you can operate, and also how they would change at the different stages of growth? Like when a company is smaller, certain things that might be more effective versus less effective when you actually get to a substantial level of scale.
Absolutely. And I think as an entrepreneur, that's probably one of the biggest conundrums for anybody starting a business. You start out with recruiting people that you trust, you work together, and then often, as soon as you get investment, then things explode really quickly and you have to scale at pace. And I think that's often the biggest problem for a lot of entrepreneurs. I think for me, culture is based on behavior. So in the organizations where I've worked and loved working, and the engagement scores have been really high, and we've met all of our targets, and the performance of the business has been fantastic, it's where the things that make up your culture, so whether that's, however that looks, but it's all behavior-based and non-negotiable. So how many times do we see in an organization, or we hear CEOs talk about, oh, such and such a person is really, really good at the job, but they've got terrible behaviors. So they they undermine everybody else. They're political. They're badly behaved. They push their own agenda. But for a lot of CEOs, the fact that this person is technically strong is enough. Now, that never works. Your culture will never be great in an organization where good behavior is optional. That's the first thing. I think it depends on what kind of CEO you are. If you get your culture right, if you look at any of the kind of, the research on this, you will outperform your competitors by 30%. Now, I do a lot of work, a lot of coaching work and kind of high performance stuff with a lot of entrepreneurs. And what's really wonderful about working with those types of people is they are very conscious and committed to creating great culture because they want to learn. They want to leave a legacy. They want people to come to work for them and enjoy going to work. So I think as long as you're mindful of how you scale at pace without completely diluting the culture that makes you really special, and there are a number of ways of doing that, I think you'll be fine in terms of scaling. But I think it's when you scale so quickly that if you are really a CEO who is focused on creating a great culture, there are a number of things that you have to do to make sure that you scale whilst also maintaining that you're still recruiting the right people. There's still non-negotiables over the behavior. And it's a bit of a balancing act. You don't always get it right. But I think for me, culture, regardless of whatever organization you're in, whatever size, whatever scale, how quick you're scaling, as long as you make your behaviors non-negotiable and people behave properly, they treat each other with respect, there's high trust, people are collaborative, you won't go far wrong.
How do you go about identifying dysfunctional components as part of a team? Like with a more commercially oriented type team, like, sales team, you do have a specific target, if people are on target or not. There might still be things that are wrong, even if you are meeting target. But there are a number of other teams, I don't know, an engineering product team, where things are not necessarily as obvious. So how do you go about identifying when something isn't working? There are perhaps, the wrong behavior, even if they've not necessarily been escalated.
Yeah, I think, look, if you're a good leader and you're connected to your people, they will self-regulate. Culture self-regulates when it's good. So what you'll find is culture becomes implicit, and when people step outside of those agreed sets of behaviors, then the team will self-regulate. So if you're a good leader, if you've missed, I would hope that in all teams that I've managed, and I've managed some pretty big teams, that I had a really good handle on who was behaving well and who wasn't. If they weren't behaving well, then I removed them because behavior is really important to me. It was a non-negotiable. I didn't want anyone on my team that had bad behavior or was political or sexist or anything like that. But I think ultimately as well, if you're connected to your people, you'll find that when people aren't behaving on the team, they will report it to you. And I think there's a number of ways of doing this. Things like 360-degree feedback reviews, peer-to-peer review. This is massive now. So rather than a leader turning around and saying, actually, Giovanni, this is my feedback for you today, what they're actually doing is they're regulating and providing the feedback amongst their team. So peers provide peer-to-peer feedback on each other. It's part of the culture of the team. Much more powerful, because then there's an expectation that in order to be part of this team, part of your success is aligned to how you're perceived by your peers, the impact that you have on your peers, how you show up, how you behave. So I think simple things like that, really. And if you've got an open and honest, transparent culture, I think it's how you deliver this feedback to someone that's not performing or not behaving in the right way. I think we can say anything to each other as long as it's said in the right way.
I think this is super important. And also, I love when people are trying to take other people accountable among peers.
Yeah.
Like it's not necessarily something that's coming top down. I observe the wrong behavior, but actually is bottoms up. Like even kind of, a report to their manager to say, okay, we do have these values, but I don't feel the specific values that we have been executed on in the right way. Why this happening? How do we get better on that? So it's something I really value a lot.
Yeah.
Have you seen also strategies around team building and cultural, evolving over time? And is there anything specific that, in your opinion, had a kind of a meaningful level of impact over the years?
Yeah, so I think team building, the basic building blocks of team effectiveness won't change. And I've talked about trust consistently through this podcast. Trust is the fundamental basic for any high performing team. I think the way that team development has evolved, I think there's been a big shift in that. I think generationally, I think younger generations, they want to learn in a different way, so they like to do things digitally. I think typically when I was kind of going through my career and a long time ago, you had the classroom scenario where you would be grouped depending on your seniority or your potential. And if you were high potential, then you'd have access to certain programs with a peer group and you'd go and do those. I think it's all changed. I think what's really, really interesting, I think what's wonderful about where we are now, I think we're more focused and conscious that people want to be treated as individuals. So where I see team development working really, really well is it's a holistic approach. So it's multifaceted and you have multiple layers and multiple interventions for each individual. So I think first and foremost, there's an expectation that learning by individual is important. It's an expectation as a leader that everyone on your team has an interest in learning and that there's an expectation that they are on a journey to somewhere, that they take responsibility for that, and that it's a blended approach. So I've used loads of brilliant tools like Jaya, for example. Jaya is brilliant. And it basically has a number of characteristics. It scores you. And those characteristics then roll up into different leadership types. So say, for example, entrepreneurial leadership, servant leadership, transformational leadership, etc., etc. But that platform allows you to pick out individual characteristics that you're either strong in or not strong in and actually build a development journey around it. So again, it's self-managed. I think this whole spoon-feeding approach to development for people it's not particularly effective. But similarly, I think if you are working in an intellectual business where IQ is really, really favoured, then, alignment to some really good universities, for example, Said Business School, Ashridge. I've also, in different environments, brought that kind of academic capability into an organisation to professionalise it, to add real theory and thought leadership. I think it depends on your audience, but I think there's a number of ways of doing it.
Actually, on the audience piece, is there any advice you have around companies have a wide range of age group, for example? Like we see in particular in tech, there's very much younger generations that are part of these organizations. They're scaling relatively rapidly. They don't have lots of experience. They've not seen a lot. And in particular, when there are the kind of challenging aspects of building the company, they get impacted quite a bit and they can feel a little bit scared about certain things because they don't understand it. So how do you build teams and culture when you actually need to deal with a wide range of people? Specifically, it's not necessarily only age, it's also kind of personality, background, culture.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, this, isn't it? I think I see a lot of organizations and leaders fall into the trap of thinking that they have to know all of the answers to how this works in an environment like you've just described, for example. And actually, what I've done kind of consciously in several environments when we've been looking at what is the development, what's the development strategy for the whole organization, taking into account different generations, different skill sets, different disciplines. It's so hard to cater for everybody. But what I've seen work really, really well, and I think in the best organizations, is the leadership co-design, or the HR function co-design. So first of all, they do a needs assessment and a needs analysis based on those individual target audiences, so that first they really understand what the expectations are. I think for any organization, if you're an employee, there's nothing worse than someone telling you who doesn't know you, who doesn't understand your discipline, that the only development opportunities available for you are a sheep dipping approach where everybody's subjected to the same program. I think where it works really well is that organizations really plug into their people, they survey them, they understand them, to really build up a good baseline of what they need, what it looks like, and engage them in the process. And I think ultimately it's a very simple kind of nuance, but what it means is that the agenda and the interventions that they design and the strategy is based around what people have said they need. taking into account the technical disciplines, taking into account their individual preferences, taking into account their generational differences.
We touched on a lot of topics today, and again, this has been super exciting. Is there any specific advice you have for people listening? And they can be, take this as broad as you want, can be around the culture, can be around building teams, can be about creating more effective organizations. Is there anything that you would want to share?
Yeah, I think at the moment, what I think a lot of us have fallen into the trap of doing is being pissed off about things and not doing anything about it. So I think, basic psychology suggests that if you want to change someone's behavior or you want to see a difference in someone's behavior, you need to change your own first. Because as humans, what we do is we mirror each other. So really, really powerful. And I think, the one expectation, I think, for anyone, if something's not working in your organization for you, or you observe things that don't work, take responsibility for that and then have the right conversation. We talked about, high-performing teams. I think the worst thing that I see so often in so many organizations is you'll be working with a group of people, you'll think that there's trust there, and then one of your peers or your colleagues goes to your manager and provides feedback about you to them. And I think that's probably one of the most undermining things that anyone can do, and it really dents the trust in the relationship. I think the most powerful thing is if you see things that don't work for you, have the conversation with the person involved. I think that's really, really important. It's a very basic thing, but take responsibility for yourself. Don't assume as an employee that leaders have all of the answers, and be really clear on what you expect and actually articulate it and make sure that your manager knows what you need, how you need it, and hold them to account.
And be direct, I guess.
Yeah, be direct and be honest, because people don't know. We're not mind readers. And I think at the moment, you talked about it, didn't you, Giovanni? Everyone's so busy at the moment. Yeah. A lot of the little bits and bobs, they get missed because when people are busy, when leaders are busy, they are so focused on task and delivery that sometimes they might miss, what's going on for individuals in their team, which is just the nature of the beast.
And ultimately, if you don't ask, you don't get. So
no, exactly. I agree with you.
Any resources you would recommend for people to dive deeper into the topics we touched on?
Oh, yeah. You know what? I'm a real believer of kind of self-learning. So I like to there's loads of great podcasts out there at the moment. So I think listen to Diary of a CEO. You've got to listen to that, haven't you? That's
familiar with it.
Stephen Bartlett. We were all listening to that. I think Mel Robbins is another one of mine. She does a lot of stuff for people to create a better life and actually take responsibility for them. So really loads of practical tips. I do a lot of work in that space. But I think for me, in a kind of the tools that I use when I'm doing big jobs in corporates or going to lead big transformation or culture programs, Gartner, for me, is brilliant. Gartner has all of the latest leadership and thought leadership on everything that's going on from a culture perspective, from a workforce perspective in all different areas, whether that's technology, whether that's culture, whether that's HR practices. And for me, they're one of the best. They tend to be ahead of the curve. So if you want to know what is going on outside and what the trends are, Gartner is always my kind of go-to place quite often.
Amazing. Jordan, if people want to stay up to date with what you're doing, they want to follow your journey, where do they go?
Sure. So at the moment, I'm actually developing my website, which will be probably going live in the next kind of 4 weeks or so. But I've been so busy, I haven't had time to do any of this stuff, which is obviously, you'll be familiar with that. But LinkedIn, so Jordan Barry-Bayliss, look at all of my stuff. I've got quite a large following. I'm known for being quite candid and a bit disruptive on calling things out.
And we love that a lot.
Okay, great.
Jordan, thanks very much for taking the time. It's been great.
Yeah,
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
My pleasure.